What kind of damage do trunk mounts do to cars? Should you get a Xiegu G90 or a Yaesu 891? And the age-old debate, to crimp or to solder, this time on Mailbag Monday. What's happening, guys? Thanks for tuning in to K8MRD Radio Stuff. If you have an amateur radio-related question for me, shoot me an email, k8mrd@icloud.com. Just put in the subject Mailbag Monday. Guys, let's dive in. We got 3 great questions for you. Let's have at it. This first question comes all the way from Canada asking, can I please show any damage or lack thereof from the trunk mounts on my car? So he's got a lot of questions here, so I'm going to tackle a couple of these right now. Is there any bending of the panel? No. Any rust? We'll get to that in a second. Do you use the supplied piece of metal to protect the paint? Absolutely not. Throw that thing out. Do you have those lip mounts installed when you lived in Michigan? Yes, I did. Did the road salt eat any cracked paint or promote any rusting? Not really. Do you have any extra ground strap from the trunk of to the body of the vehicle? Did that rust at all? So I've made it abundantly clear several times on the channel. I have done 0 grounding and bonding on my car. 0. He goes on to say he just bought this Comet antenna and would love to use it a bit, and he is crying on the inside because it doesn't do 60 meters. So let's hop outside and take a look, and I'll take off the trunk mount, and we'll kind of assess any damage that may have become of it from the probably, 4 or 5 years that the mounts have been on there. So let's do that. Pay no attention to the dead bodies in the trunk. They won't hurt you. We ready for the big reveal? All right, so let's slide this guy off. And we can see we have a nice perfect outline of where this was. Now, this has been on for several years. And before, this is the new one, but before I had this for the ATOS, I had one on here for the Tar Heel. So let's see if a little spit will rub that out. I mean, if spit doesn't do it, I don't know what will. T-shirt. So there's definitely some markings here that are probably permanent. You could probably with a compound, before you wax, you use that whatever it is, compound stuff. That might take that out, but yeah, there's definitely some markings here. Now, as far as under the mount is concerned, don't do what I did. I ground the paint off here, and there is a little bit of rust starting to form. I mean, this is years in. Don't use the little metal plate that comes with the mount, and don't grind the paint. You can kind of see there's little grooves where the screws have kind of dug in over the years from me moving and doing stuff with this. That's all the connection you need for one of these mounts to have a good ground. So a little bit of damage, but that's more caused by me doing what you're not supposed to do. Sometimes you find things out later. So there's definitely some damage. I don't know if it's permanent damage by using these kind of trunk mounts, but you magnetic mount guys, you're not in the clear either, because check this out. It's starting to rain a little bit, but when I first got into amateur radio, I had a magnetic mount here, and you can see this ring. Now this was from, this was on when I lived in Michigan, so there's a couple Michigan winters there, but it's kind of bubbled up the paint and everything. Sorry it's wet. I can't get a better shot for you, but yeah, I mean, you can definitely see that circle there. So yeah, not the greatest thing for your car. So there you go. I would say mount at your own discretion. Maybe do something to protect it somehow, but I'm not the guy to tell you how to do that. But thanks for writing in. I do appreciate it. This next one is a question that I'm sure a lot of guys are going to have a lot of opinions about. Let's take a look at this. I'm looking at doing some portable communication, POTA contacts. Awesome. That's a great way to start a question. 2 questions. How big should the battery be? And if I add the Xiegu amplifier, what size? What do you think about this radio? He goes on to say, I'm also considering the 891, but budget is an issue, especially if I have to add a tuner. So if you're comparing these 2 radios with the amplifier, as far as budget is concerned, it's a no-brainer. Get the 891, hands down. So the Xiegu G90 usually runs between $450, and the amplifier I think is usually around $550 to $600. So on the high side, let's say you're already $1,000 for that, plus you need to buy a battery. Now, if you're just going to do the G90, I use a 6 amp hour battery, and it has lasted me longer than I really needed it to for what I'm doing, but it depends on what kind of mode you're doing. I'll get a couple hours out of it if I'm doing like 20 watts FT8. If you need more than that, maybe a 10 amp hour battery. You really probably won't need anything bigger than a 10 or 12 would probably be max with that radio. I mean, you'd go all day with a 12 amp hour battery for that. Now, when you add the amplifier, you're going to be using a lot more power. So at least a 20 amp hour if you're going to be out there for any length of time. And, if you're doing FT8, maybe even a 30 amp hour battery if you're planning on being out there all day. It really depends on how long you're going to be out there. So the other part of your question talks about the 891, but you're on a budget issue. So the 891 is about $650, but you also throw in if you have to add a tuner. So you're getting a resonant antenna. So you really don't need a tuner at all. I honestly don't remember the last time I was out in the field, other than when I was reviewing an antenna that needed a tuner, that I brought a tuner. I just don't use them. So you can save $200 just by not getting a tuner. You have a Wolf River Coils antenna, so that's resonant already. You can go 80 through 6 with that antenna without ever using a tuner at all. You're going to spend less money with the 891. You're going to have a better radio. It has better filtering, specifically noise reduction and a notch filter, which the G90 does not. You also have that 100 watts built in, so you don't need the amplifier. Yes, the tuner in the amplifier for the Xiegu is fantastic, but unless you're just really into using non-resonant antennas, which it doesn't sound like you are because you're using Wolf River Coils, you just don't need an antenna tuner at all. Hands down, 100%, I would say in your situation, get the Yaesu 891 and the Wolf River Coils, and you don't need anything else. 20 amp hour battery, you'd be fantastic with that. The 891, 20 amp hour battery, Wolf River Coils, that is a heck of a setup, buddy. So hopefully this helps make your decision, and either way you go, I hope to work you on the air. Thanks so much for writing in, and good luck getting on the air with POTA. You're going to have a lot of fun. Lastly, is probably one of the oldest debates in mankind: to crimp or to solder. This viewer is writing, thanks for the Mailbag Monday. I have a query about power poles. On your advice, I bought the crimper you recommended. They work great, fantastic. Certainly better than other crimpers I have. What do you think about soldering the power poles sometimes during the crimp process? So every now and again, I will solder. Usually I'm just a crimper, but usually I'll solder if I'm trying to cheat. So, for example, if I'm using a smaller gauge wire than the actual power pole that I have, I might, trim off a bit more of the jacket on the wire, fold the wire back on itself to kind of thicken it up, crimp it in, and I'll give it a solder there just kind of as a cheat. But as a general rule, no, I don't typically solder. But I think this is a great question. So I want to hop over on the bench. We're going to do some experiments with soldering and crimping and power poles and see what kind of results we get. So come along with me. Here we have a little experiment that I ran. I took 4 power poles with 12 gauge wire. I crimped one, I soldered one, I crimped and then soldered, and then I soldered and then crimped. So taking a look at just the crimp here, we can see that we've got just this beautiful, delicious, solid metal crimp here. What has happened when you crimp properly, all of the strands of wire are going to get so crushed that they form one single solid piece of copper. I believe they call it a cold weld, if I'm not mistaken. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So there is no question in my mind that that is a very, very solid connection. And a fast one, mind you. It is very, very quick to just crimp. And if we look at the other end here that I cut off, we can see the same thing happening here, like right where the connector starts, it's just solid metal. And then you'll see the strands here where it's not crimped. So crimping is a very, very good connection. Next we have just solder. And one thing I found out is that when I was cutting this, I was using a Dremel tool with a metal cutting blade on it. This connector got so hot, it actually started reflowing the solder, and this just flew off and yeeted itself across my room. What was more interesting was the way this wire actually was soldered. Now, I flooded this with solder. There's so much solder in here, it's actually inside the jacket. It flowed all the way into where it's bending right there. But there's still some strands that don't really have a lot of solder on it. So, you know, is that really a good connection? I'm thinking no. I'm not really happy with what I see here. There's no mechanical connection. It's just you're melting metal in there in hopes that you have a good connection. Now, will this work electrically? Yeah. But it's also, in my opinion, the weakest of these. So we'll leave that there. Next, I crimped and then soldered. And we can see here, we've got that same thing that we saw with just the crimping. We formed a nice cold weld. It's just solid copper in there. You can't see any strands. It is just one solid piece of metal in there. Now, the solder, I suppose, did something. I can't see it hurting in any way. If anything, if there's some gaps somewhere, if you're maybe using a too small a wire or something, I don't know. But I don't see any negative effect of soldering after crimping. And again, here we can see the end of it. It's just all nice, solid metal there. So that works. Next we have solder and then crimp. And I'm gonna tell you, I felt kind of dirty when I was doing this. It felt like I was crushing the solder and the wire as opposed to really forming a good weld. And now I'm purely speculating, so take this with a grain of salt, but I don't know how well this is gonna show up on camera, but there's a bit of silver and copper mixed in here. And I suspect that's because we didn't quite get that good a cold weld as we did with the crimping alone, or the crimping and then soldering. I mean, this still looks like a solid hunk of metal though. I mean, there's no strands or anything in there, so I was surprised by the outcome of this, and I do kind of think this might fail over time. Again, purely speculation, but there is solder. The solder wicked all the way in to about there where it's bending. So there it is serving some purpose. So for my money, I would crimp and then solder. I would say the solder alone is a horrible way to put on power poles or just make an electrical connection in general. And the solder and then crimp, it feels wrong to me. It just feels wrong when you're doing it. So that's my 2 cents. And hey, we got to learn something. This was fun. So there we have it. 3 out of 4 times, it works every time. Great question. This is a really fun experiment to do too, so thanks for writing in. Guys, that's going to wrap up this week's Mailbag Monday. If you have a question for me, shoot me an email, k8mrd@icloud.com. Just put Mailbag Monday in the subject. Don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. You can also follow me on Twitter @k8mrd, and we'll see you again on another episode of K8mrd Radio Stuff. 73, guys.